percent.
From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill, we know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America. Happy Friday and welcome to Firstpost America, your global pit stop for the latest news and headlines from the United States and around the world. I'm Eric Ham, coming to you live from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. We'll get you a roundup of all the day's top stories, but first, let's take a look at the headlines. Washington demands answers from Israel after 2 mass graves are uncovered near hospitals in Gaza. Officials recover almost 400 bodies, including some still wearing surgical gowns. The Philippines, France, and the United States hold joint maritime drills in the South China Sea. Beijing calls the naval exercise provocative. The United States will withdraw some troops from the Central African nation of Chad. The move comes just days after Washington agreed to move forces out of neighboring Niger. India's 6-week-long election resumes as millions line up outside polling stations for the second phase of voting as parts of the country is experiencing a heat wave. And thousands of indigenous community members protest against the Brazilian government for planning to build a railway through ancestral lands of the indigenous tribes. We begin in the United States, where the race for the White House takes another strange twist. Presidential candidate Donald Trump faced 2 separate legal tests in New York and Washington. Here in the nation's capital, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments surrounding Donald Trump's claims of absolute immunity from federal prosecution over election interference in 2020. A majority of the justices did not embrace complete immunity for the former president. However, the conservative judges who hold a 6-3 majority did lean toward a certain degree of immunity for U.S. presidents. Meanwhile, Donald Trump was in New York attending his hush money trial and was denied permission by Justice Juan Merchan to travel to Washington for the immunity case hearing.
This is just a political witch hunt. Thank you very much.
How are you feeling about the Supreme Court argument in Trump? Are you able to do this in the argument class?
I think that the Supreme Court has a very important argument before it today. I would have loved to have been there, but this judge would not allow that to happen. I should be there, but he wouldn't allow it to happen. I think he puts himself above the Supreme Court, which is unfortunate, isn't it? But the U.S. Supreme Court had a monumental hearing on immunity, and the immunity having to do with presidential immunity. And I think it was made clear, I hope it was made clear, that a president has to have immunity. You don't have a president, or at most you can say it would be a ceremonial president. That's not what the founders had in mind.
Now, despite juggling 2 legal cases, Donald Trump did find the time to verbally attack his opponent, President Joe Biden.
Open your eyes, and we can't let this continue to happen to our country. On another matter, you know, the economy has just been reported to be doing very badly. The stock market's way down. And some horrible numbers came out, including very high numbers on inflation, and in particular gasoline at $7.50 in California. And very importantly, as you look at the various colleges all over the country and beyond colleges, because it's happening in other areas too, you see what's happening on the front having to do with Palestine and Israel and protests and hate, anger, Biden is sending an absolutely horrible message. Horrible, horrible message. He has no idea how to message. He can't speak. He can't put two sentences together. He doesn't know what to do. This is not our president.
Meanwhile, President Biden rallied in upstate New York with a message of what he is calling as America's comeback story. President Biden pledged to make America the leader in semiconductor technology.
We're bringing advanced chips manufacturing back to America after 40 years. And it's going to transform our semiconductor industry, a pillar of a modern economy. And it's going to create an entirely new ecosystem in research, design, manufacturing of advanced chips here in America. Folks, I determined that I'm never going to let us be vulnerable to wait lines again. If it's essential, we're going to make it here in America. And together.
Now, President Biden's trip to the Empire State comes just a day after he went after his rival Donald Trump and criticized the ex-president's policies during his tenure in office.
Trump added more to the national debt than any president in a single term in all of American history, the national debt. I cut the national debt so far and still got all these other things in by doing simple things like, remember those 40 Fortune 500 companies, those Fortune 500 companies, 40 of them, I think it was 50, who didn't pay a single penny in taxes, made $40 billion. Guess what? I did a terrible thing. I made them pay 15%. And we cut the deficit by $70 billion.
Now, going on the offensive, President Biden also took direct shots at Donald Trump and his much-discussed hair.
By the way, remember when he was trying to deal with COVID, he said, just inject a little bleach in your veins. He missed it, all went to his hair. Look. I shouldn't have said that. I probably shouldn't have said that. You guys are a bad influence on me.
Now, as Donald Trump shuttles from court to court, President Biden's speeches and campaign stops have emphasized an improving economy and maintaining America's political heft on the diplomatic stage. And with Donald Trump sticking to personal attacks against his Democratic rival, President Biden is slowly taking the lead in early polls by focusing on political and social issues. Momentum shifts, ebbs and flows, and the occasional October surprise are always the hallmarks of a White House run. But this race is shaping up to be unique, even by presidential standards. What to expect day to day is anyone's guess, and I suspect with a mercurial ex-president and an elusive incumbent, they would not have it any other way. In China, where U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on an official visit, America's top diplomat met his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in Beijing yesterday. The two discussed a range of topics from the wars in Gaza and Ukraine to U.S. sanctions on Chinese firms and even Beijing's claim over the island of Taiwan. Now, this is Secretary Blinken's second trip to China in less than a year, and the first since the in-person meeting between President Joe Biden and Xi Jinping in November of last year. Secretary Blinken began his trip with a day-long stop in Shanghai, where he interacted with China's business community. However, Secretary Blinken was given a cold welcome in Beijing, with his Chinese counterpart making some rather undiplomatic comments on bilateral relations.
But the China-US relationship is facing more negative factors and all kinds of disruptions. China's legitimate development rights have been unreasonably suppressed, and our core interests are facing challenges. Should China and the US keep to the right direction of moving forward with stability, or should we return to a downward spiral?
The Chinese foreign minister also warned the United States against interfering in China's internal matters and sovereignty, which includes Beijing's claim on Taiwan.
China's requests are always consistent. We always call for respecting each other's core interests and urge the United States not to interfere in China's internal affairs, not to hold China's development back. Do not interfere with China's sovereignty, safety, development, and not to step on China's red lines on sovereignty.
Meanwhile, Secretary Blinken advocated for more active diplomacy between the two nations and did avoid any miscalculations as the U.S.-China ties witness a historic low.
But in Beijing, the President asked me to travel back to work on moving forward on the agreements that our two presidents reached in San Francisco at the end of last year. Resuming cooperation on counter-narcotics, restarting our military-to-military conversations, looking together at the future of artificial intelligence, its risks, safety issues, and trying to strengthen our people-to-people connections, but also, critically, managing responsibly our differences. Moving forward on the agenda that our president set requires active diplomacy, and there's no substitute in our judgment for face-to-face diplomacy in order to try to move forward, but also to make sure that we're as clear as possible about the areas where we have differences, at the very least, to avoid misunderstandings, to avoid miscalculations. That really is a shared responsibility that we have, not only for our own people, but for people around the world, given the impact that the relationship between our countries has around the world.
The two senior diplomats held bilateral talks that lasted nearly 6 hours, calling them extensive and constructive. Secretary Blinken also met Chinese President Xi Jinping to address the growing range of differences between the two global economic powers. And Xi Jinping has warned Washington against crossing the red line by supporting Taiwan. The Chinese president also said the two countries should work together as partners and not as rivals. Secretary Blinken's trip to China comes amid the backdrop of the United States promising more military aid to Taiwan and potentially banning the Chinese social media app TikTok nationwide. Now, it remains to be seen if Secretary Blinken's trip to China will improve relations between Washington and Beijing. But what we do know is the Biden administration remains committed to both continuing and open dialogue with Beijing, even if major differences persist. And in the Middle East, calls to free hostages held by Hamas are intensifying. Latest reports say Israel is willing to come down on its original demand for Hamas to release 40 living hostages in exchange for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza. Now, according to Israeli media reports, Israel could now be willing to accept the release of just 20 hostages in the first phase of a truce deal, so long as those released are women, men over the age of 50, and those who are seriously ill. The last proposal, drafted by negotiators from Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, that called for the release of 40 hostages was in fact rejected by Hamas. Now Hamas claims that it does not in fact hold that many hostages in those categories that are still alive. However, it was still not specified how long the truce would actually last in the exchange for the release of 20 hostages. As the deadlock continues, Israel's war cabinet has reportedly authorized its negotiating team to discuss this more flexible approach with an Egyptian delegation. The delegation is in Tel Aviv today to continue talks on a ceasefire and hostage deal. In fact, earlier this week, Hamas released a video of one of the hostages it is still holding. This was seen as a potential sign that it is too looking to strike a deal, and soon. The video was that of an Israeli-American hostage named Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who accused the Israeli government of abandoning the people being held hostage by Hamas. After the release of the video by Hamas, there were clashes outside Netanyahu's Jerusalem home, and protesters lit bonfires and raised their hands painted red while chanting, "Bring them all back home." Angry demonstrators also swarmed the car of Israel's far-right security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir.
We came out today to call for the immediate release of all hostages, even in the name of not continuing this awful, horrible war that has killed the hostages up till now. And we hope that our message will be heard by the people who are responsible, and that they will come back now.
Meanwhile, leaders of 18 countries, including the United States and the UK, have called on Hamas to free the hostages. The families of Israeli hostages held in Gaza have put renewed pressure on the Netanyahu government to restart negotiations for a temporary ceasefire in exchange for those still being held captive by Hamas.
The Families Forum welcomed the statement from the world leaders calling for the immediate release of all hostages and putting the issue of the hostages as a top international priority. We are grateful to all the countries that participated in this joint call, and we urge other world leaders to unite in this demand.
It's the time not just to make statements, it's time not just to say words, it's time to make actions and to understand that we are dealing with a radical terror organization that only wants to destroy us. And it's time for the world to wake up and do everything that in its power to bring those people back.
As the conflict passes the 200-day mark and families of the hostages await the return of their loved ones, negotiations have made almost no headway, with Hamas and Israel blaming each other for lack of flexibility. Meanwhile, Israel has vowed to dismantle the remaining Hamas stronghold in Rafah. It also says that it will, in fact, evacuate the over 1 million Palestinians sheltering there before an offensive is launched. Now it remains unclear how Israel's military offensive in Rafah will impact ongoing negotiations for hostages and a ceasefire. But what is clear, pressure is growing on all sides to find a solution to this rapidly intensifying situation. And moving to Africa, torrential rains and floods have ravaged parts of the continent. Eastern Africa is grappling with a devastating deluge, which has destroyed infrastructure, flooded fields, and impacted livelihoods. At least 200 people have died across Tanzania, Kenya, and Burundi. For a region that is already grappling with the dire effect of climate change, the floods are only going to make the situation worse. Our next report explains the details.
Flooding can be particularly catastrophic for communities. Almost every year, regions of Africa are hit with heavy downpours resulting in floods. These floods, in turn, bring death, destruction, and an outbreak of diseases. In recent days, torrential rains, floods, and landslides have battered towns and cities across Eastern Africa, especially in Tanzania, Kenya, and Burundi. At least 200 people have died and dozens have been injured across the three countries. For a region that's already grappling with the dire effects of climate change, the floods are only making it worse. In Tanzania alone, around 155 people have died. It's more than double the number of deaths reported just 2 weeks ago. Incessant rains have affected some 200,000 people and upended the country's infrastructure. Farms, roads, buildings, and bridges have suffered extreme damage. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of homes were also destroyed, and some were even swept away. Tanzania's weather department has warned that heavy rains and strong winds are likely to continue in the coming days. Now in Kenya, the military has been deployed to rescue victims. This was after President William Ruto called an emergency meeting to respond to the flash floods. So far, at least 45 people have died and thousands have been displaced. Large parts of the capital Nairobi and other major towns are underwater, which has sent residents scrambling for shelter.
We are at a loss for where to begin with our current situation. We lack both food to feed our children and clothes to wear. Our utensils have been washed away and our homes are filled with mud. Some areas have even lost their iron sheets. We are stranded and unsure of what steps to take next. We desperately need assistance.
The floods come on the heels of months of drought that had left millions across Kenya facing acute food shortage. Kenya's meteorological department has now warned against the breakout of diseases such as malaria. In Burundi, people are struggling to cope with the aftermath of torrential rains. Thousands have been displaced, while many schools and homes have been damaged.
Since last year, the rain and the water levels have been rising here. Little by little, the land is getting waterlogged. Now, it has reached this level and we have never seen it this bad. It's terrible. It's the first time I've seen it like this in my lifetime.
The relentless rains have pushed up the level of water in Lake Tanganyika, which has further caused chaos for communities living along its shores. Climate experts say flooding in Burundi and elsewhere is due to extreme weather conditions like the El Nino weather phenomenon. El Nino is a climate pattern that's associated with causing unpredictable weather worldwide. While in some parts of the world it brings severe drought, other parts suffer catastrophic rainfall. Analysts add that while climate change may be a trigger, Improper infrastructure and land planning are exacerbating the situation in East Africa. Now, as residents deal with nature's fury, the devastating floods only underscore the need for an urgent response to mitigate the impact of climate change on vulnerable communities.
And staying in Africa, in Namibia, the government is furious over an incident at its most famous tourist spot. 3 tourists were seen posing naked at the Big Daddy Dune in the Namib desert. The behavior of the tourists have left the locals aghast, who are now demanding action. Photos and videos of the 3 men that were widely shared on social media have sparked sharp reactions. While some say the tourists did not bother anyone, that there is nothing wrong with sunbathing, others are calling the behavior sickening, saying that the privilege of traveling comes with responsibility. Our next report gets to the bottom of the naked truth.
This is the Big Daddy Dune, one of the largest dunes in Namibia's Namib desert. It's quite a popular tourist destination. Many people who come here like to hike to the top of the dune to have a stunning view of the crests. But a recent incident at the Big Daddy Dune has put authorities on alert and has left the locals aghast. 3 male tourists were seen posing stark naked on the sandy dune with their clothes lying next to them. Photos and videos of the 3 men have been widely shared on social media, sparking sharp reactions. Shocked by their behavior, angry locals are calling for action against the tourists. Namibia's tourism ministry says the tourists might be blacklisted from entering any of Namibia's parks. Public indecency is punishable by Namibian law. Authorities said the tourists had left the country by the time they received the reports. They also appealed to Namibians to report violations of park regulations immediately for swift action. But some on social media didn't share the same view. They said there was nothing wrong with sunbathing and that the tourists did not bother anyone. Namibia is not the first country to deal with the naked tourist photo phenomenon. Australia's Uluru, Paris's Eiffel Tower, the Great Wall of China, Bolivia's Salar de Uyuni. The list is long. Popular tourist spots and heritage sites across the world have been facing this, and it hasn't been going down well with the locals. A Russian influencer was deported from Bali after posing nude against a 700-year-old tree. There have been a string of cases, fines and deportations in Cambodia and Malaysia as well. Earlier, 4 people were arrested for allegedly taking naked pictures on Malaysia's Mount Kinabalu, considered sacred by tribes who believe that the mountaintop houses the spirits of dead ancestors. 2 Americans were arrested in Cambodia for taking nude photos at the holy Angkor Wat temple. Disrobing at Machu Picchu, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Peruvian Andes, has also resulted in several arrests. Rio de Janeiro's Christ the Redeemer statue has also had a nude man posing in front and mimicking its pose. Behavioral analysts say that in many situations, it's social media that drives tourists to use foreign countries as a stage for themselves. The lack of education and being blissfully ignorant about local customs are other reasons. This trend has been continuing for years and shows no signs of abating. Now the collective outrage against it is also rising. While tourists seem to be making the naked photo phenomenon their rite of passage, tourism hotspots are bringing in stricter guidelines to deal with the menace. But shouldn't tourists be more mindful in the first place? After all, the privilege of traveling also brings responsibility. The responsibility of respecting another country, its values, its customs and traditions, and most importantly, its people.
That's all we have time for today. We certainly thank you so much for tuning in. We hope to see you right back here next week. Have a great weekend. From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. from the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill. We know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on First Post America.